la présentation de Marion Girard Dorsey. Donc, Marion Girard Dorsey is an associate professor of history, a faculty coordinator and core faculty in justice studies, and core faculty in medical humanities, society, and ethics minor at the University of New Hampshire. She earned a BA degree from Stanford University, majoring in human biology and in history, a law degree from Harvard University, and a PhD in history from Yale University. She's the author of A Strange and Formidable Weapon, British Responses to World War Poison Gas, and has also published material on the history of medicine. Her new book, Holding Their Breath, How the Allies Confronted the Threat of Chemical Warfare in World War II, just got released earlier this year. So I'll give you the floor now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's organized and hosted this conference. I'm appreciating being part of it. If you please wave or do something if you can't hear me. I'm not sure between the noise outside, although I love having the air, and everything else, that my voice will project to the back. So please just let me know. My paper is titled When Fears Are More Important Than Facts, Britain's Perception of Gas Attacks and Their Impact on World War II. In 1932, Stanley Baldwin, a British prime minister and long-term member of parliament, famously proclaimed that the bomber will always get through in a House of Commons speech, a speech publicized widely through a reprint in the Times of London. His prediction envisioned airplanes carrying conventional weapons and gas. His was not a lone voice. There was a widespread conviction in Britain and elsewhere that a future major war involving the great powers of the world would use gas regularly. Gas would be dropped from planes and it would target civilians. While this prediction proved untrue, it was based on a foundation of logic and realism. The tangible human and material damages of gas attacks in the early 1900s, from wounds to contaminated ground, were real, and the British remembered them. It was perceptions of those gas attacks and predictions about future ones, though, more than the physical damages chemical weapons had wrought, that shaped and dominated British fears about future great power wars involving gas. Fears that were sometimes extreme, irrational, and unrealistic. Fears are a critical and complex influence on the British gas interwar story, ones that cannot be ignored. Studying the role of fears, rational and irrational, in this story helps explain why British expectations about future chemical warfare were wrong, but also offers insights into human behaviors, one shaped both by logic and emotion. Fears helped drive interwar beliefs and actions by lay people who believed future gas attacks would not only be more destructive and widespread than the ones in World War I, but also by government officials who believed some lay people in society would panic when faced with gas, thus causing unnecessary loss of life. Or to put it another way, some fears were greatly exaggerated. Some were more realistic and even rational, considering past experiences with gas. Some were held by the general population, and others by the government about the general population. I also want to stress that fear is not one emotion, but really an emotion that can be felt and expressed along a spectrum of rationality and irrationality, from concern to panic, and all variations are part of this story. Yet while the recognition and discussion of fear along with other emotions is a growing field in history, analyzing its role and influence in this period for this nation and in their preparation for chemical warfare is new. British interwar perceptions of and predictions about gas arose out of experiences with the first widespread use of gas, and I think almost everyone in the room is very familiar with that. Gas use in World War I was, after the first deployments, between adversaries, mainly on the Western Front, who were more or less equally matched for chemical warfare. As everyone here knows, the first large-scale recognized attacks were by the Germans who released chlorine against unsuspecting and unprepared French, Algerian, and Canadian troops. Suffocating and surprising victims, gas was deadly, but it was also terrifying. Despite the fact that gas was arguably not a technical violation of international law because the Germans deployed gas via canisters and not the projectiles banned by the 1899 Hague Conventions. And I know Milos is going to talk much more about the laws of war, so that's about all I'm going to say about that here. The public outcry in the House of Commons, as well as in the popular press, uniformly condemned the Germans, but not solely in legal terms, also in moral terms. For example, Undersecretary of State for War H.J. Tennant denounced the Germans in Parliament, He wrote, quote, "It was not believed that any power which had signed the Hague Convention could be guilty of so heinous a breach of its solemn undertaking." Now, breach is certainly a legalistic term, but heinous is not. In the popular press, one could find Kaiser Wilhelm II depicted as a horned, demonic scientist in league with the devil, as he conjured gas in a lab decorated with a baby pierced by a bayonet, a snake, and other indications of atrocities or sneakiness. The Germans, or at least their leader, was diabolical. Moral repugnance aside, practicality demanded that the British respond on the Western Front, escalating in kind. In fact, their policy was to use was to follow the Germans in this sense, be prepared to escalate, but to follow them. All the while developing increasing sophisticated masks, gases, and delivery mechanisms. Gas played an increasing role in the British war effort for the rest of the conflict, and before the armistice, production plans for 1919 envisioned the trend would continue. Post-war, among the many lessons the British thought they had learned from World War I, was that gas could be fearsome and it was here to stay, at least if no one found an effective way to prohibit it. Furthermore, just as weapons like airplanes and machine guns had evolved over time, gas had too. The trend would surely continue. Yet while the British learned to tolerate chemical weapons in World War I, the dominant but not universal post-war perception of poison gases was negative at both the grassroots and the political leadership level. There were some expectations. For instance, Winston Churchill was one of the proponents of gas use to save Brit lives by avoiding close fighting in the empire. Periodically, officials in the British Empire did request gas use, usually tear gas for riot control purposes. Although scholars have debated whether Britain used gas in Iraq, largely chemical weapons were resisted, at least until 1933 in Palestine. Even then, however, the British did not approve wholesale use of gas, but only tear gas, and only by law enforcement in situations where the cabinet believed gas would be safer, perhaps even more humanitarian than guns. Britain would have to continue a very restrictive gas policy. With regard to lethal military gases, the interwar period, especially the 1920s, was an era in which arms control and collective security were championed around the world, in bodies such as the League of Nations and during negotiations that resulted in gas bans during the Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22 and the Geneva Gas Protocol of 1925, as well as the failed World Disarmament Conference. It's worth noting, though, that the British diplomats, politicians, and the general staff were aware that international weapons treaties were unlikely to provide complete shields against gas. Yet the diplomats felt compelled to sign the treaties and politicians to ratify them, at least partly because of public pressure. Pacifists and arms limitation groups were active, and out of concern for Britain's international reputation. In this case, it was the politicians and diplomats who feared, realistically or not, international pushback if they did not bind themselves to treaties they believed were weak on their faces and vulnerable considering existing global tensions. Their interpretation that the Geneva Gas Protocol, for example, was weak on its face was logical. It prohibited gas use among signatories, but it did not prohibit gas use by or against non-parties, which in the end included Japan and the United States during World War II, or provide a punishment if a party did use gas. Responses would have to be generated by the parties, not the treaty, such as in-kind retaliation and public condemnation of a nation that used gas. Yet if a country feared the damage to its reputation if it did use gas, and its foe did not, the treaty bound a signatory without protecting it. Even so, the British representatives signed them. They felt they had to do so. In the end, the Geneva Gas Protocol was the strongest legal protection against gas during World War II, but it does not mean that it was a treaty in which there was a lot of faith. Despite these diplomatic efforts, and although there's no evidence that the public followed or fixated on occasional use of gas in the empires, or other empires even, over the course of the interwar, parts of the British population embraced not only the idea that gas would remain a typical weapon of war and might evolve gradually, but it also adopted the fearsome possibility that gas could be used in new and extremely more destructive ways than it had been in World War I. There were some loud voices who espoused the view that gas use would cause catastrophes, and these could be heard in some famous novelists. Lord Halsbury, a military expert and a veteran of World War I, wrote nonfiction and fiction about poison gas during the interwar period. His novel, titled 1944, which was published just a few years after the armistice in 1926, imagines horror and catastrophe. In his book, Russian gas attacks killed civilians excruciatingly in mass casualty events, decimated the leadership in Britain, and even caused survivors to break almost unbreakable social mores. One result is that some Britons resorted to cannibalism to survive. Less bloodthirsty, but perhaps as horrifying, H.G. Wells imagined belligerents using sterilized gas on their foes in future wars in one memorable scene of The Shape of Things to Come, an interwar novel about the future, or as he called it, future history, that recounted gas attacks around the world. Now, I know there's a movie made, at least one out of The Shape of Things to Come, and I have to admit, I don't know how much the movie changes from the novel, but I'm going to focus on the novel here. Written in a pro-natalist 1933, his vision of sterilizing inhalation gas, as he called it, a chemical weapon that would eradicate not only its victims, but their progeny, illuminated a world in which one of the basic functions and goals of humans would be denied, leaving individuals without families and nations without future supplies of labor and soldiers. As exaggerated and fictional as Wells's work was, it cannot be dismissed as the product of a prolific and creative author who needed to push the boundaries of his genre to earn money and lure audiences. He may have had multiple motivations for writing, but for our purposes today, the key point is that Wells and Halsbury were not alone. Wells may have been one of the most famous novelists to incorporate poison gas, but he wasn't the last one either. For instance, Sarah Campion in 1937, in her novel, 30 Million Gas Masks, described a world in which the initial German attack on Cambridge destroyed the city and its population in a new war, contaminating it for years. With the destruction of a city, even annihilation, while the destruction of a city, even the annihilation of it was awful, it would not have been unimaginable to people who'd lived through World War I and knew history of more distant periods. What was unusual, to say the least, was that Campion included a character, Judith, who had deep pacifist beliefs. Yet those ideals were corrupted by the dreadfulness of a gas attack, such that Judith was willing to kill anyone who resisted pacifism. She was basically corrupted by gas into sort of having a strange view of pacifism that would kill anyone who wanted to go back to war. This was truly a warped outcome. Not all outspoken British voices cried out with such emotion and exaggeration, even if they feared gas. On the domestic side, lay people expressed fear in the vulnerability of international arms limitation efforts by demanding domestic protections against gas. And there were efforts by government representatives and by private companies in Britain to respond, overlapping with the novelist's outcries and increasing over the course of the 1930s. The concern about gas was rational, even if conviction behind that fear turned out to be extreme. For example, the British press showed an awareness that other countries in Europe instituted gas drills to be used during potential future gas attacks, along with complaints that Britain was not engaged in the same activities. An Illustrated London News headline announced, quote, "Everyone's doing it," in this case, preparing civilians for gas attacks, but us. The Air Raid Precautions Body took on responsibility for gas drills, and other groups embraced the logistical, financial, scientific, and manufacturing challenges of making gas masks and plans to distribute them, if necessary without cost, to civilians if a war became imminent. Whether the government authorities really believed those tools and techniques could protect the population, at least some of the experts involved took the goals seriously. For instance, the designers' debates about the best way to create baby gas masks that would protect very young children and still allow the mother to protect herself involved sociological discussions. Questions arose such as, did families have enough prams or carriages to build masks that simply enclosed the child in the carriage? And there were scientific questions. Was it wise for the mom and the baby to share a mask if any danger to the mother or the baby would result in the production of 2 casualties? The idea for some was put them together, right? Companies also took up the perceived slack in domestic protection, and magazines and newspapers displayed ads for gas-proof offices, and my favorite is dog kennels. These were thoughtful debates and solutions, and whether or not they would work depended partly on the enemy. An enemy attack that included both gas and conventional bombing might deny civilians safe gas-proof rooms, thus putting them in greater danger than an attack with only conventional armaments or weapons of mass destruction. However, the other danger came from within, as the government planners knew well. If the civilians panicked, then they would not don their gas masks properly or in time, or even keep their uncomfortable masks on. Anti-gas efforts included consideration of, quote, some form of street warden. As the official who proposed this idea wrote in a memo, these officials, if sufficiently numerous, would be able to do a good deal to counteract panic and to advise the public. Yet he also recommended some sort and simple instruction. Trained volunteers and education campaigns evolved with national government encouragement and local efforts in Britain, so that people intellectually and instinctively knew what to do during an attack. Other tactics focused on debates about how to design a baby gas mask so that the mother would not kill her unhappy child by ripping off the gas mask to comfort him. This was a lesson, I think, both in the assumption that mothers would be in charge of babies, because they only ever talk about mothers doing this, and that they, not other adults, would panic if the child cried. That's really what they worried about. One solution was to create a gas mask in which the baby could see his parent and perhaps even suck his thumb. If you look at the mask, they sort of go over the child around the waist, hopefully keeping him and thus his mother calm. In these examples, therefore, the government perception that there was a low panic threshold in part or all of the population dictated, or at least swayed, anti-gas policies and designs. The British perceptions of gas arising from interwar threats in use in empires, such as the Italians' deployment of mustard gas in Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia, in 1935 and 1936, deepened feelings of horror about chemical weapons and concerns about their threatening nature. Partly because the European gas use in Africa was asymmetrical, and thus it seemed brutal in a way that it had not been when it deployed against a well-equipped foe in World War I. In addition, the Italian decision to drop gas from airplanes against unprepared, sometimes unshod, let alone unmasked, military and civilian victims in Ethiopia, represented a dreaded if logical advance in the technological deployment mechanisms. The actions were seen as barbaric, as illustrated by the Times of London's publication of a Red Cross witness who called, quote, the permanent blinding and maiming of hundreds of helpless women and children with gas was a monstrous weapon, which surpasses in fearfulness the wildest dread of a disordered imagination. Sounds almost like some of those novels that I mentioned earlier. These perceptions, combined with evidence that gas could be deployed from planes, reinforced the expectation of British politicians and laypeople that chemical weapons would be used in the next major symmetrical war, the conflict that became World War II, in ways that proved to be more destructive and painful in the past. Viscount Cranbourne summed up this recognition. Quote, if gas had been used in Abyssinia, then I suggest that it is an issue of the very first importance, and an issue which affects not merely Abyssinia, but indeed the whole future of civilization. Now, technological barriers and humanitarian lines have been crossed in Abyssinia. It's no wonder that the civil defense preparation efforts in Britain escalated during the rest of the interwar period. It was possible, looking back at the lessons of World War I, that gas would be just another unpleasant weapon of war. Some public disgust and fears were logical. If gas remained in the arsenal, certainly techniques for using it would evolve. Interwar use in colonial conflict supported that. Tensions within Europe, and especially events like the Spanish Civil War, reinforced the lesson the lesson learned from the attacks in Abyssinia, that boundaries protecting civilians would continue to erode. Fear also led to public pressure to accelerate home defense options again against gas. It was a powerful force. Extreme irrational fears, as illustrated by the novels mentioned in this talk, spread throughout British society too. And these fears helped sustain government concern about fear and panic, concern that influenced the construction of babies' masks and inspired other anti-gas actions. Thus, fear, or rather a complex set of fears, played a role almost every step of the way during Britain's interwar journey to prepare to face gas emotionally and physically, until the war began and such gas preparations and fears may have seemed unwarranted, as the semi-professional survey organization Mass Observation found out. At that point, fears were expressed in a new way. In 1940, it conducted a survey. Some lay people refused to carry gas masks, despite government urging to be prepared for a sudden German gas attack on the home front. And they did this, they said, because they did not want to look like cowards. They were afraid to appear afraid, which they thought they would happen if they were carrying a gas mask. For their sakes, it was lucky that the gas attacks never came to pass. Fear was not the only factor in the British story, nor can it be dismissed as merely emotional and irrational. There were some logical reasons to believe that gas would appear in the next war, or the next European war at least, and that it could be destructive. That prediction was wrong, but it was not foolish. However, the extreme fears that whole societies would be destroyed, whether by cannibalism or civilians too panicked to take basic precautions against gas, turned out to be illogical. But it's important to note that the emotion could shape plans for a very tangible weapon, and that the emotion involved had a reasonable foundation of logic underlying it. Thank you.